The Garden Creek and Mount Pisgah story begins beside the Pigeon River, just south of Canton, North Carolina, where Garden Creek flows out beneath the northern slopes of the Mount Pisgah Massif. At first glance, it is a landscape of water, floodplain, old fields, and mountain ridges. But beneath that surface is something deeper, a native ceremonial and mortuary landscape, with mounds, burials, shell, copper, mica, earth lodge architecture, and a long sequence of occupation and memory. This video follows one central question: how should we understand the carved stone and fired clay images connected with Garden Creek and Mount Pisgah? For more than a century, that question has often been forced into a simple choice: real or fake, ancient or modern, sacred tradition or fraud. The thesis argues that the evidence is stronger, sharper, and more honest when we refuse that false choice. The proper standard is not a blanket verdict. Garden Creek itself is not a fraud. It is a documented native mound and village landscape. The real question is object by object. Which pieces can be proven ancient, which may be historic period native work, which were comparison made, which were altered or repaired, and which remain unresolved. Between 1879 and 1884, the Valentine family of Richmond, Virginia, working through their Haywood County agent A.J. Osborne, gathered a large collection from the Pigeon River Valley. The collection included bowls, pipes, vessels, animals, human figures, fragments, ornaments, and unusual carved images. The surviving catalog photographs and records show a vast image-bearing corpus, preserved on catalog card pages and linked to V.7501 numbers. These images are not proof by themselves. They are the visual trail, the map of the problem, the surviving face of the controversy. From the beginning, the correspondence shows an effort to track where objects came from. The Valentines asked Osborne for find spots, labels, tickets, and descriptions of the ground. Some objects were tied to Garden Creek, Pigeon River, Burnett's Hill, Miller's Hill, stone graves near Pisgah Creek, and other named contexts. At the same time, the record is not clean. It contains gaps, pieces marked with no ticket, and even an imitation class. That candor matters. It suggests a mixed collection, not a simple hoax, and not a perfectly sealed archaeological deposit. The strongest cultural document in the thesis is the December 1880 Bushyhead letter. In that letter, Benjamin Valentine reported speaking with a Macon County Cherokee man called Chief Bushyhead. The letter says that in the western North Carolina mountains, people found images, and that medicine men used them to bring rain. The writer also admitted uncertainty, noting that the speaker's English was limited and that there may have been misunderstanding. That caveat does not erase the statement. It makes the document more human and more credible. A primary era report, carefully hedged, connecting images, medicine specialists, mountains, and rain. This rainmaking evidence should not be stretched beyond what it can bear. It does not prove every object was ancient. It does not prove every carving was used in ceremony. But it does establish that, before the 1883 Smithsonian conflict, someone in the Cherokee mountain world described image objects as medicine men rainmaking material. When read beside Cherokee traditions of divining and rain power, and beside Creek and M.V. Scott square drowned grammar of fire, water, medicine, women, feathers, all grounds, and renewal, the rainmaking interpretation becomes more than a guess. It becomes a cultural possibility grounded in a period document. Then came 1883. Smithsonian field agent John W. Emmert entered the same region and reported that local men were making soapstone objects for sale. He procured comparison specimens, sent reports, and repeated allegations that objects had been manufactured and even buried to deceive collectors. Those claims are important. They proved that local carving for pay existed. They proved there was a market. They proved that the Smithsonian had an active comparison and procurement stream. But accusations are not the same thing as proof. Emmert's strongest allegations depended on unnamed informants, whose names, he said, should not be used. Several spring 1883 letters are still missing in full text. The Smithsonian accession file also clarifies that one famous accession number, 13,191, was a small box of mound bones from the Asheville area, not the main soapstone object lot. So the Smithsonian episode documents controversy, rivalry, payment, and comparison making. It does not, by itself, prove that the earlier Valentine finds were fabricated. The skeptical evidence still deserves full force. Some objects show anomalous themes. horses, riders, firearms, and exotic animals raise hard questions. Later accounts describe fakes and imitation pieces. In 2025, thermoluminescence testing returned two recent blast firing results among 8 sampled objects, while 6 samples were too insensitive to date. Those two recent results are serious adverse evidence for those sampled zones. They cannot be ignored. But they also cannot be stretched across the whole corpus. Thermoluminescence tests a sampled area, not an entire collection. A recent result on one zone may mean a modern object, a repair, a refiring event, or another modern intervention, depending on condition mapping. 6 insensitive samples are not clearances, but they are also not proof of modern manufacture. The science, like the documents, pushes the thesis toward the same conclusion. Every object must be tested according to catalog number, material, context, condition, and custody. The material question is especially important. Emmert's era included a claim that freshly carved soapstone could be aged by soaking in iron-rich water. The thesis separates surface staining from internal alteration. Iron water can discolor a surface. It cannot create through-body firing signatures, deep wear, soot penetration, or mineral phase changes. If talc-rich steelite has converted to enstadite through heat, that is a laboratory-testable firing event. Then the next question becomes when the firing happened. That is where mineralogy, microscopy, thermoluminescence, and careful sampling come together. The iconography is equally complex. The catalog includes many animal figures, with bears especially prominent, and many human figures in seated, kneeling, and standing postures. It also includes pipes, vessels, bowls, human-animal figures, and fragments. The thesis compares this imagery to multiple symbolic systems, especially Southeastern clan and ceremonial structures. The expanded scorecard ranks MV Scope or Muscogee Creek as the strongest weighted comparator, followed by Uchai or Uchi and Cherokee. But the report is careful. This is a comparative research lead, not proof of authorship, descent, ownership, or authenticity. Swenton's Creek square ground material helps because it is not just a list of animal symbols. It describes a whole ceremonial grammar, fourfold space, central fire, medicine and water renewal, offices, women's dance, feathers, ballpost symbolism, and cosmological repair. That matters for Garden Creek because sacred landscapes are not only collections of objects. They are organized worlds. Fire, water, earth, ancestors, ceremony, community, and memory. The thesis also insists on place name discipline. Swenton does not name Garden Creek as Abica, Tukabachi, Casita, or any other creek square ground. Canuga or Canuga remains a live named locality hypothesis, but it still requires independent map, language, documentary, archaeological, and consultation controls. Similar structure is not the same as identical place. A comparison is a path for research, not a conclusion. The ethics of this story are not secondary. Garden Creek is a burial and ceremonial landscape. The record includes mortuary material, shell bead regalia, possible wampum or shell bead assemblages, mound burials, and a history that passes through Eastern Band leadership on the Kuala boundary. That means interpretation, display, testing, and publication must be guided by descendant community consultation. The question is not only what can be proven, it is what should be handled with care. So where does the thesis leave us? Not with a slogan, not all real, not all fake, not a vanished people, not a solved hoax. It leaves us with a disciplined framework. Garden Creek and Mount Pisgah are a documented native sacred landscape. The rainmaking attribution is a verified period statement of unresolved scope. The Smithsonian fraud narrative is evidence of accusation and comparison making, not final proof. The catalog photographs preserve the visual breadth of the corpus, but only object-level work can decide individual status. The story becomes more powerful when stated honestly. Some pieces may fail, some may prove modern, some may be historic period native works made after contact, some may belong to older traditions, some may remain unresolved. The task now is to match photograph to catalog number to custody, custody to context, context to material science, and every interpretation to consultation. In the end, Garden Creek is not just a puzzle about carved stone. It is a lesson in how history can be flattened by labels. Fraud, relic, specimen, curiosity, sacred object. Each word can reveal, and each word can erase. The thesis asks us to slow down, separate accusation from proof, and return the place to its first reality, a native landscape of mound, river, mountain, burial, ceremony, and memory. The unresolved objects still wait for testing. The letters still wait for final verification. The communities still hold the deeper authority. And the land beside the Pigeon River remains what it was before the controversy began. Not a marketplace of curiosities, but a place where ancestors, water, fire, stone, and story meet.